All right, here's part 3 of George Orwell's 1984. Was it BBC's government-sponsored anti-propaganda? Well, there's 3 basic orientations I was mentioning toward governments. You could even say towards the status quo, or towards the powers that be, or towards institutions. There's anti, pro, or neutral. Anti-government, pro-government, or neutral. Anti-institution, pro-institution, or neutral. Anti-status quo, pro-status quo, or neutral. So those who are generally anti-governments or anti-institution, they may be least likely to perform those behaviors that result in rewards from governments that enhance their social status, such as seeking and landing government contracts, government jobs even. But also they're less likely to comply with laws, which, in many cases complying with laws can be advantageous to one's social status and economic prosperity. Further, people who are anti-government, anti-institution may be less familiar with the protections offered by a particular legal system and less likely to use those protections that they're not as familiar with. So the degree of anti-government or anti-status quo or anti-institutional sentiment helps to discourage people from using a legal system. If there's a lot of pro-government sentiment, if people have a sense of the legal system is protecting them and is morally justified and is good, then and is simple, then they're more likely to study the legal system and favorably interpret whatever they find. What are their opportunities and protections through the court system, through the legal system? So in mid-2002, when I started researching the forecasting of trends, I had no idea what I was getting into. I just was researching forecasting. I didn't even know what trends I would be looking at. I not only found trends of things like birth rates, but also of the inflation-adjusted cost of fuel, which had been dropping dramatically for many centuries, but then reversed trend in 1999 and began to rise. The inflation-adjusted cost of fuel, in particular oil and gasoline, but also other fuels, reversed trend in 1999 and began to rise. That's across all currencies, just whenever adjusting for inflation. We could say relative to other types of commodities. Fuel commodities went up faster than any other type of commodities and really any other type of investment from 1999 until 2008. Oil went from $11 to $148 per barrel in US dollars. That's an increase of well over 1,000%. So I also found in 2002 and shortly after trends in the approval ratings of governments, as in trends in pro-government sentiment and anti-government sentiment. Further, those trends of social psychology about sentiment towards and against governments closely correlated with trends of stock market price. I didn't know that. I didn't even consider that possibility until I saw that research and explored further. So trends of stock market prices were an excellent predictor of things like the re-election of an incumbent president in the U.S., as well as the sentiment ratings towards the current U.S. president. Stock market prices predicted election results. Stock market prices predicted sentiment ratings and approval ratings towards sitting presidents. I had never thought of this before. I never looked at the data. I looked at the data. I was very intrigued. So apparently sentiment ratings towards the current U.S. president is polled much more frequently than overall sentiment about the entire U.S. government in general. But we now find that people are polling things like that more often than they were in the 80s or 90s. There's even a trend in what's being polled. There's more polling of people's sentiment towards the government in general. And that goes along with a shift in sentiment because people are, in many cases, less sentimental or have less favorable sentiment towards governments in general or the U.S. government or the government of Greece or the EU or whatever, depending on where the polls are being taken. I don't mean to be exclusive to the U.S. That's just what I'm most familiar with. And in 2002 and 3, that was the data I was looking at, was for the U.S. government. So as it relates to stock market prices and how stock market prices predicted sentiment in regard to the approval ratings of a president and re-election of that president. Changes in stock market pricing predicted changes in approval ratings and re-election results. So I encourage people to use the protections offered by any legal system. I do not say to do that because of any concern with morality or fairness, but only concern with what I call practicality, just a practical concern. Use the protections offered by any legal system without consideration of morality or fairness as the first consideration. If you consider that later, great. If you can legally increase your net worth and your profit, why not? Wouldn't you be interested in that? In other words, if you can legally reduce your taxes, why not at least explore it? If you can legally reduce your debt, why not at least explore it? If you can protect your assets from probate courts and from litigation, why not at least explore it? Of course, I personally offer services in those realms. So it's not just that I'm encouraging that people concern themselves with practicality first and things like morality and fairness only in the context of practicality. Just out of a general principle. I am doing it out of a general principle. That's true too. But I also specifically encourage people to use my own services solely for the practical value of those services. So I like practical value. Morality, I've studied it. It's quite intriguing. Fairness, well, fairness is something that also varies. Different court systems and different people may over their lives have different opinions about fairness or morality. Values change over time, whether that's when somebody's 5 years old or 50 years old, or just, as politics change, as economics changes. So protect your assets simply because it's valuable. It's practical. Reduce your taxes simply because it's valuable. Reduce your debt simply because it's valuable. And if focusing on morality is valuable and practical, then do that. If focusing on fairness is valuable, then do that. However, be aware that moralities vary from place to place and time to time. Practicality is always valuable. Practicality is what guides shifts in morality. Value and evaluation changes, and that changes the evaluations that people have of various behaviors. When their system of value or belief system or their priorities shift, then that changes how much priority particular behaviors would have for them. So moralities are learned, as in indoctrinated from one generation to another, from one group to another. When the elite are propagandizing the masses as to the morality of a particular war and the immorality of a particular target enemy, that is just practical propaganda. It is valuable to the elite to program systems of morality in those ways, even if it's untrue that the target enemy is actually guilty of whatever they're accused of, something like the possession of weapons of mass destruction. It's not practically relevant whether the accusations are accurate. Are the accusations effective? Do they move sentiment? Do people have moral outrage at the target enemy accused of possessing weapons of mass destruction? If the public opinion shifts, that's the practical value that a propagandist is interested in, that a governing elite is interested in. So, first, condemn the morality of possessing weapons of mass destruction. Then, accuse someone, maybe a few people, but how about someone in particular, of violating that morality. That's a very practical way to distract people from the clear and obvious fact that the one making the accusation is also violating that same moral code. Using weapons of mass destruction to punish someone accused of the crime of possessing weapons of mass destruction is ironic. It's a classic example of the practical amorality of the elite in governments and media outlets worldwide. They program morality into the masses, and they program different moralities over time. Why? For their practical purposes. Arab leaders might have used the same principles of propaganda to justify something like an economic embargo against NATO. The OPEC leaders, most of whom are Arab, might say economic embargoes are morally wrong. Plus, NATO is accused of planning an economic embargo against someone somewhere. Therefore, we must punish them by using an economic embargo against them. The elite in one system may pretend to be quite different from the elite in another system, but even with various notable differences, some variations, there may be tremendous consistency in their methods. In the blog, I have lots of images of tanks and against civilians, whether that's in China, Algeria, Tunisia, Tampa, Florida, wherever it may be. So, governments, all of them, consistently use organized coercion to collect revenues such as taxes. They also punish others for the unlicensed practice of extortion and racketeering. Only officials like government tax agencies and government's tax agents are allowed to legally practice extortion and racketeering. Blackmail and bribery are also illegal throughout the world except for law enforcement agents when making deals with suspects to get more information about other suspects. They do bargains with people's sentences. They do pardons, and we'll wipe your whole criminal record clean if you just give us information that leads to blah, 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 blah. So in that case, blackmail, bribery, bargaining of that sort, and even in some cases torture and threats of execution have been used quite consistently by governments for thousands of years. From police officials to the guards of prisoner of war camps, reservations, and internment camps, government officials use whatever methods they deem practical. They use whatever methods they deem practical. They're the ones who indoctrinate morality, justice, fairness, and so on. Why? Because they govern, they influence attention, perception, and behavior with their organized coercion as well as propaganda. Governments may cover up atrocities when practical, or blame them on their enemies, such as when the Soviets blamed the Nazis for the massacres at Katyn Forest in Poland in 1940. If governments plan and implement an atrocity, they may blame it on someone else. They may cover it up and say it didn't happen. Lots of possibilities. Governments also consistently offer lenience, like presidential pardons, to convicted criminals who are the friends or business partners of the ruling officials, such as the pardons granted to Oliver North, who was smuggling weapons illegally, but in ways that met the approval of Ronald Reagan and the officials within Washington, D.C. that were in power at the time. So, shouldn't we condemn all propaganda, all organized coercion, all deception, all fraud, all extortion, all racketeering? Or at least some of it? Even when performed by governments? Or even particularly when performed by governments? Shouldn't we be like all the more righteously, passionately outraged when a government practices organized coercion? Well, what if governments are inherently operations of organized coercion? Then it would be kind of weird that we would condemn them all the more fiercely. It's kind of like condemning the sky for being blue or condemning grass for being green. We may have been trained to have the reaction of condemnation towards instances of propaganda, deception, fraud, extortion, racketeering, organized coercion, governing, and so on. We may have been trained. If someone isn't our government doing it, and if we don't like how they're doing it, if we don't have the perception that they're doing it for our benefit and fairly and consistently and so forth, well, then we're upset about it. We want to go invade that country to save them from organized coercion of their government. Oh my God, that's just so horrible. Now, 100% of the governments on the planet might do the same thing, but when we focus in on one enemy that does it, now it's justification to invade and liberate that particular place. So, those who condemn such patterns of behavior may include many who practice such behavior. For instance, let's review the personal history of George Orwell. Now we get to the title of this piece. From 1941 to 1943, he was a propagandist for the BBC, the British government's public TV station, British Broadcasting Corporation. Here is another interesting detail. On the outbreak of World War II, Orwell's wife, Eileen, started work in the censorship department in London. That's one of the kinds of things that he was writing about, was censorship of mass media. By the way, while Americans might not know it, Orwell's references to a Ministry of Information were not fantasy, but part of his daily life in the UK during World War II. Was Orwell assigned by government officials to write his famous book? I don't know. However, it is notable that the BBC made Orwell's 1984 movie into a TV movie in 1954. And that movie, when broadcast, did produce a wave of people identifying themselves to the BBC as outraged by the ideas presented in their TV broadcast of 1984 by George Orwell. Here's a quote from Wikipedia. The production proved to be hugely controversial, with questions asked in Parliament, the British Congress, and many viewer complaints over its supposed subversive nature and horrific content. Also, so in other words, it produced the exact kind of results that anti-government propaganda is supposed to produce. It produced an outrage, and people reported themselves to the government saying, I'm outraged by these allegations that governments use propaganda and censor information and are manipulative and deceptive. Well, anyway, if Orwell's writing was so threatening to governments, then how is it that his two books, 1984 and Animal Farm, together have sold more copies than any two books by any other 20th century author? Wouldn't he have been targeted and then censored? Isn't it odd that I was introduced to the book 1984 as assigned reading in a public school class? If it's so detrimental to governments to have that book be out there for people to read, why are government schools assigning it to people? The book 1984 is represented, such as in government high school classes, as a condemnation written by a disgruntled BBC propagandist in 1948 and published the next year. However, only 16 years after writing it, 1984 was made into a TV program by the BBC. Isn't that more than a little ironic? If George Orwell was so anti-government, why did the government of Britain and the BBC television station so support him by making that movie, which of course increased popularity of the book? I'm sure they paid him to produce the book into a movie, right? So how anti-government are they? How anti-government is the government? Was the government station BBC intentionally stirring up anti-government sentiment in 1954 by making George Orwell's 1984 into a movie and presenting it on TV? To propose that they were not intentionally stirring up anti-government sentiment is rather ridiculous. Of course, that's what's going to happen when you produce the book 1984 into a movie and broadcast it. Of course, it's going to produce scandal. Of course, it's going to produce anti-government sentiment. Of course, people are going to identify themselves as outraged by it. Wasn't that the whole point? Was Orwell from the beginning intentionally stirring up anti-government sentiment? Of course he was. If so, why? Well, what did he write in regard to the intentional stirring up of anti-government sentiment? In his own book, he indicates that anti-government propaganda can be created by governments and used to stir up anti-government sentiment in order to create thought criminals and entice the thought criminals to identify themselves to the government. That's the storyline of his book. Again, I do not particularly condemn the use of organized coercion by governments or by anyone else. For thousands of years, groups of humans have killed each other. To exclusively celebrate a particular occasion of organized violence, such as the U.S. Revolutionary War or Civil War, seems odd to me. One may be anti-violence or pro-violence, but why some of each? Why is that so often the case? Morality gives you this chance to be anti-violence in some cases and pro-violence in other cases. That's I don't know if it's hypocritical, but that's weird. Why moral justifications? Well, because they're practically valuable. Other than after-the-fact moral justifications indoctrinated by propagandists on behalf of the winning group of organized coercion, I'm not aware of any reason to celebrate or condemn any particular instance of organized coercion or of propaganda. In other words, propagandists are the ones who tell us to condemn propaganda or celebrate it. Propagandists are the ones who tell us when a war is morally justified or not. In advance of the war, to drum up support for the war, after a war, during a war, propagandists tell us, program us, indoctrinate us with moral sentiments, with value judgments. Basically, when I say sentiment, I mean moral sentiment. It's kind of implied. Any sentimentality is morality. So, wars in particular, of course they're dangerous, and governments in general are dangerous, but recognizing their danger does not imply condemning them. I also recognize the danger of sharks, airplane crashes, gambling can be addictive, pharmaceutical drugs, some of them in particular, heart surgery, it's dangerous, and tornadoes, it's dangerous. So, former British government propagandist George Orwell's anti-government propaganda was noticeably successful. Even the government liked it, or perhaps even especially the government there in the UK. The BBC took only a few years to make 1984 into a movie. It took nearly 50 years for the BBC to make Huxley's Brave New World into a movie. Again, though, the BBC, a government channel, made two of the most famous books of anti-government criticism into movies. Isn't that extremely odd? I was assigned both of those books in public high school classes. Isn't that also extremely odd? Public high school classes. I was assigned these two anti-government classics. Do governments ever cultivate anti-government sentiment? Of course. If so, how often? Further, exactly how practically valuable is it for them to do so, to create anti-government sentiment? Do governments ever discourage people from using the protections promised by government courts? Yeah. Do political activists ever threaten people with economic repercussions for their political activity? Yes. In West Africa in the 1990s, apparently thousands of people had their hands cut off, like cut off from their arm, for daring to vote the wrong way, so to speak, in an election that had implications for the global diamond cartel, De Beers. In the recent movie, The Gangs of New York, politics as presented as openly violent. Lots of movies present politics as openly violent. Any war movie, I guess. If there is such a thing as political violence, then violence can be political and politics can be violent. As for me, I promote the full use of government protections, of any government, wherever, such as evicting delinquent tenants, reporting all sorts of crimes, including white-collar financial crimes, to bring about the arresting and punishment of certain people, and the use of the most skilled and effective criminal defense lawyer that a suspect is able and willing to hire, the use of the most skilled and effective lawyer in a civil case, any case. Further, I promote the full use of government protections, such as asset protection, tax planning, estate planning, and debt interventions, including the reorganizing of one's finances under bankruptcy exemptions and benefits. If someone chooses to volunteer more money than is legally required, for instance out of guilt, so be it. However, if someone chooses to exercise their personal discretion and personal responsibility to the fullest extent possible, so be it. If some people create legal systems, or alter them, or even oppose and overthrow them, so be it. If some people use lobbying or bribery or diplomacy or any other means to produce changes in a regulatory policy or regulatory practices of any particular governing system, so be it. If George Orwell and the entire BBC create anti-government propaganda to incite anti-government sentiment, so be it. If I tell everyone to occupy Wall Street or to put their money into insurance industry Ponzi schemes or whatever else, so be it. Maybe I get commissions from everyone who follows my advice. Or maybe I'm sincere in just doing it to ease my own fears or to ease a guilty conscience. I actually did forecast the major opportunities and risks of the last 9 years in the global economy. However, lots of folks may prefer to focus away from the actual practical risks and actual practical opportunities to instead argue about propaganda, government corruption, immorality, injustice, and of course, arguing. I might say, people should not argue. I condemn arguing. Well, on the other hand, maybe some people encourage others to argue, even about particular subjects. Here, let us tell you that you should argue and what you should argue about. Why? Because it's practically valuable for huge portions of a target population to be arguing amongst themselves, rather than looking at the actuality of risks and opportunities to be arguing. Christians versus Muslims, as in NATO versus OPEC, Democrats versus Republicans, boys versus girls, etc. Divide and conquer is still practical, right? Maybe we should ask George Orwell and the BBC.